Good morning, everyone, both people in our meeting house and on Zoom. Good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County. Now for an introduction to our speaker, we have today Dennis D. Parker, and he will be speaking today, very important topic, what the pandemic revealed about racial and economic justice. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed multiple cracks in the nation's social foundation in areas ranging from healthcare, employment, education, discrimination in law enforcement, and housing. Predictably, those most vulnerable are people of color, immigrants, the indigent, and low-wage workers. Though necessary, the various vaccines will not address those cracks. This talk today will address what we must do in the post-pandemic times, hopefully we'll get there at some point, to achieve the elusive goals of equity and equality in the United States. So Dennis D. Parker, our speaker today, serves as the director of the National Center for Law and Economic Justice, NCLEJ. It's a national organization founded in 1965 to fight on behalf of low-income and economically disadvantaged people. Prior to joining NCLEJ, Dennis served as the director of the Racial Justice Program of the ACLU, chief of the Civil Rights Bureau in the Office of New York's Attorney General, and for 14 years worked on and directed the educational work of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School, Teachers College, and New York Law School. I'm proud to introduce Dennis Parker. Thanks. Okay, you have.
It's a real pleasure to be here today. A little bit about my background and my organization, NCLEJ. I have, as you've heard, been a civil rights attorney for the 41 years now that I've been practicing law, and actually one job that isn't listed there is my first one, which was working for the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn doing criminal defense work. And that was my introduction to some of the systematic failures, the being part of a system which some people now just call a system rather than a justice system because of the absence of justice, which occurs very often in that particular system. During the time that I've been practicing law, I've been working in a number of areas, from housing to employment to education, as I mentioned, the criminal justice system, mostly looking at things through a racial justice lens. And the one thing that I've learned in that 41 years and in my life before my life as a lawyer is the fact that although economic and racial justice are different, they are not the same thing. And I've had previous discussions of people saying, no, it's not race, it's class. It is class, but it's race too. They are not proxies for each other. They are not the same thing. They often hang around in the same rooms. They usually hang around together, but they're not the same things. And that really informs the things that I want to discuss today. My organization, NCLEJ, do we have any lawyers? Or is it all just people here? Oh, I'm sorry.
We're not people, you're right.
Right. Well, so then I'm not alone in not being a person in this room. NCLEJ started 65 years ago, as you heard, in New York City, but working nationwide. And it started out as part of the national welfare rights movement and was instrumental in some really important cases that dealt with the question of due process in public benefits. And the public benefits work was based on the idea that things like SNAP and AFDC and all the other programs that were created to provide benefits for people who were in the most vulnerable positions economically were essential. as a way of providing access to the economic system. So it was not only how do you keep people alive, but how can you make it possible for them to participate in society? And in fact, you may have read a study in the New York Times that said everything from preschool to public benefits are one of the best ways to make intergenerational change. That it affects not just what happens to you now, but it affects what happens to your children now and what will happen to them in the future. In spite of the importance of these programs, our early work was really dealing with the fact that it was and remains difficult for people to get access to that safety net for procedural reasons. One of the cases we did very early on, I say we, I was in like 4th grade then, but was the Goldberg versus Kelly case, which provides for due process before you terminate someone's benefits. That work spread out beyond benefits to include low-wage workers and to look at questions of the way that systems siphon money out of poor communities. And much of our work now deals with the imposition of fines and fees in a way that, because of targeted law enforcement and traffic enforcement, tends to affect particularly black and brown communities, but also low-income communities, and affects them in a really profound way, because not only do you have to pay the $50 fine for having a tail light out, but you are assessed fines and fees on top of that, and then penalties when you cannot pay those things immediately, sometimes resulting in loss of a license. So all of these tend to contribute to the creation of a permanent underclass, or something that's effectively a permanent underclass. Against that background, I'm often asked why I left what, at least for a public interest lawyer, seems to be the ideal job. And I've actually been blessed to have what for public interest lawyers are 2 ideal jobs: working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the organization founded by Thurgood Marshall, responsible for Brown versus Board of Education and so much since then, and the ACLU, which is of course a bulwark in the fight for civil rights and civil liberties. But the prospect of becoming the executive director of NCLEJ was appealing to me because it created a possibility to look at that relationship between economic and racial justice. And so it struck me, and I've been at NCLEJ now for 2.5 years, came not knowing completely all of the work that it did, and was really pleased to see how much work it did, and in so many different areas, and impressed on me in how great the need is in so many of these different areas throughout the country. And when the pandemic struck, suddenly the facts of economic and racial inequality, which had been clear to us for decades, suddenly became known to the country as a whole. And so you heard people in some cases act with surprise to hear how close to the edge so many people were living, how disastrous the impact of not having access to health care, all of the ways that people live on a day-to-day basis, which is unseen, but suddenly became seen at the time of the pandemic. At the same time, you often hear people talk about getting back to normal. And my response to that is always to ask, what is normal? Because for my clients and my organization's climates, there is no acceptable normal. We work on behalf of low-income people who are often derided and who were in fact made targets of derision in politics in the past as being people who were unmotivated or lazy, who were welfare queens, who were not contributing members to society. But what we see in our work is people who work 2 or 3 jobs in jobs that make it possible for me to work remotely from home, because they are picking the food, working in the stores, doing the kind of work that this country depends on. And we call them essential, but not so essential that we will pay them a living wage. Not so essential that we'll provide medical insurance. Not so essential that they can provide their families with what those families need to provide. And I see these people working 2 or 3 jobs and barely surviving on that. And to add the insult of naming them essential, requiring their work, and not giving them choice is something that became even more clear. And so if normal means letting them go back behind the curtain, then that's just not acceptable. And so it makes me think, if we are able to end this pandemic or even get to the endemic stage, will we be the same? And of course we won't be the same because so much is different now. But how have we changed? And have we changed enough? Are we better? Are we more fair? What did we learn? And how will that prepare us for the future? We've seen over the last 2 years progress in the pandemic, when in the beginning of the pandemic we had only been dimly aware of what its impact would be. And then we saw it grow into something that was serious and deadly. We've watched the numbers of people killed steadily increase, seen the news that first predicted a second wave and now a third wave. And we've seen all of the impacts of the pandemic and the lockdowns it caused. And we saw that the burden of the pandemic and the lockdowns have fallen disproportionately on communities of color and low-wage workers who were either more likely to be the first to lose their jobs or to work in those essential jobs. And at the same time that the pandemic story was unfolding, we watched in horror as George Floyd breathed his last under the knee of Derek Chauvin, and seen a country that was confronted with the reality on video of police violence. And we saw a country that began to mobilize and protest against that violence. Of course, during most of that time, Donald Trump was president. So we saw uncertainty and fear. Newspapers talked about the end of the pandemic, saying that we would only truly be safe when a vaccine became widely available. And no one knew how long that would last. And we saw, particularly in the areas where the most vulnerable people live, numbers of people contracting and dying from COVID increasing until the toll is where it is now, close to, I believe, 800,000, and still growing. We saw that a disproportionate number of those are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who were stricken with the flu. And those people, as I mentioned, were most likely to lack access to health care. We saw the closing of classrooms and the change to remote learning, which also disproportionately affected students of color, who were less likely to have access to the hardware and internet necessary for remote learning, and the home environment that was most conducive to learning at home, having space in the house, having high-speed internet. And one of the stories that, when I talk about the things that were exposed, and sometimes that inadvertently exposed things that we didn't think about, and I started reading about Indian reservations that never had access to the internet, not just not access to high-speed internet, but no access. And it made me wonder for years, what have we been thinking about the fact that there is a group of particularly harmed people whose children are not learning how to use computers, which has nothing to do with the pandemic. when things became remote, they lost the little that they had. And there were these horrific stories of students in North and South Dakota who would have to go to the parking lot of CVS's or other stores in order to get internet access. And while all of that was going on, we continued to see the communities that suffered a disproportionate impact that's associated with the steady parade of police killings of unarmed black people and the continued use of inappropriate law enforcement. And we saw the creation of multiple vaccines. And we saw an election that unseated Donald Trump, even if not everyone concedes that. So where are we now? Well, unfortunately, the numbers which had previously fallen are starting to rise again as a new COVID variant spreads widely. We've heard that the employment figures have improved somewhat, although there are concerns about inflation. But at least employment has improved enough that we've learned that many businesses are having difficulty meeting the demands for new workers. The administration has announced new initiatives designed to address some of the inequalities. And if the Build Back Better Act is passed, that will provide some assistance. If it isn't, though, there are certain things that will be lost, the child credits and unemployment things that were put in place. So are we anywhere near being out of the woods? And in perhaps the most obvious way, the answer is clearly no. And I think of January 6th. And even in the areas where there's been improvement, the fact is different groups experience that differently. Employment has been returning far more slowly for people of color and for women. And even things like the efforts to provide unemployment insurance ended up being retracted in a way that some people lost access to unemployment benefits, and that was felt most harshly by people of color. And there are other trends that are also disturbing. And they may sound different. I mean, the one lesson that I've learned from having the opportunity to work in so many different areas is that it is misleading or wrong to think of areas as being completely separate. And so, for example, I'm about to speak about voting rights, and that is very central to all of the issues that I've been talking about. Education and employment, they're all linked together in a way that is very structural. And what we've seen are efforts to make voting more difficult in a number of states. In those times when we saw what appeared to be growing support for the respect of the value of black lives and a belief that fundamental changes in law enforcement appear to have slowed down. And even the apparent heightened awareness of racial inequality is threatened by the attempts to limit learning, to limit what could be taught in schools, and to prevent teaching about racial inequality. But there's a potential for growth even in the face of calamity. At the beginning of the pandemic, one show that I got enthralled by was a master class about the plague of the Middle Ages, and it was a woman, I forgot where she taught. It was a 10-part series about what happened during the Black Plague. And one of the things that she pointed out is something that you probably know, that some of the greatest improvements in social structure resulted from that most disastrous of plagues. The losses in population, obviously heartbreaking and horrendous, but resulted in shifts in the balance of power, resulting in the empowerment of farmers and peasants and the decrease in the authority of the nobility. That shift made possible a gradual end to the feudal system that contributed to the oppression of the majority of the people to the benefit of a few. Now, when the imbalance of wealth has reached unprecedented levels, perhaps now is the time for a similar shift to occur. Whether that happens will depend on a number of factors. First, we have to harness the tools we have to end the pandemic through a unified and collaborative approach. Refusals to wear masks, I took mine off, I hope, but just for now, and refusals to get vaccinated are the result of a fundamental misunderstanding of what freedom means. Too many people wrongly equate freedom with a refusal to accept the responsibilities that go along with rights. Freedom does not mean a lack of accountability, and it does not mean that you could be insensitive to the needs of other people. We cannot retreat into a willful ignorance of the country's history of racism and the impact it's had on and continues to have on the nation. We must vigorously oppose, each of us, the efforts to limit the ability to vote. Success in elections must depend on ideas and not ingenuity in creating obstacles to voting. We have to address the lack of access to adequate health care and educational opportunity. Those things cannot be dictated by wealth. Every person must be entitled to the essentials of life, shelter, health care, education, and employment. And we have to change our perception of poverty. I was listening to a podcast of the Ezra Klein Show, which is hosted by the New York Times and WNYC, I think. On that show, a Cornell professor condemned the idea that forcing people to work in jobs that do not provide living wages by depriving them of basic necessities is the best way of getting people to work. The professor suggested that it's important that people have now some bargaining power, and we're beginning to see with the strikes and people leaving jobs, that are not fair, and therefore not forcing them to choose between safety and survival. And that's a positive rather than a negative thing. Now, excuse me for the length of this quote, but it's so good at summarizing the issue of the need to address inequality and the exploitation of poverty in employment that I couldn't really cut it down much. The professor says, make work better, make the barriers disappear. But the most punitive route, taking stuff away from people until they have no choice, why should that be our first way to go? And then, of course, there's just the normative or moral argument there, which is we value liberty and freedom and autonomy so much in this country. I mean, we're just all about it until we're applying it to people who aren't like us or people who live in poverty. We don't want them to have choices, to be able to choose the job that has a schedule that works best for their family, to be able to choose that maybe they don't want to work for this 2 years because they want to be with their children when they're infants. Maybe they don't want to work right now because they want to be there for an ill parent in the last stages of their lives. We want to be able to have those choices. Many people want to be able to have those choices away from other people. Why? Think of how great and how satisfying and how productive our society could be if we created the possibility of choices that would lead to fair and fulfilling employment. And think of how serious the consequences of failing to learn the lessons of the last almost 2 years. And if instead of perpetuating inequality and making us vulnerable to every pandemic or natural disaster that came along, we took actions to prevent it. What we do as individuals and as communities, like this community, will determine what our future as a society will be. We have a choice between doing nothing to address the inequality and inequity which has been highlighted over the last almost 2 years, or we could sit quietly because it doesn't affect us, we think, while things continue to fall apart. And that choice is ours. glad to take any questions or comments.
I'd like to talk about your comment about the derision that's directed toward people who work 2 or 3 jobs and calling those people lazy and unmotivated. I know that Michelle Obama was fond of saying, when they go low, we should go high. And I hope there's a little room in going high to recognize the reality of what I call the crybaby capitalists who depend on white-collar welfare to basically siphon this money away from the poorest of people to eliminate risk from the risk-profit relationship in capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. That is, and it's what I was trying to get at when I talked about the idea that if it's for someone else, it's problematic. If it's for us, it's great. And I think that there are so many systems. I teach law students, and I really struggle because I don't want to make them think that their choice was a bad choice. I don't think that my choice was a bad choice. But I think that what I've learned over the last 4 decades is how limited law can be sometimes in the ability to do social justice work. You'll hear people talk about this idea, which is a horrifying idea, but it's one that I find it increasingly hard to disagree with. And people will say, the problem isn't that the system is broken. The problem is that the system is doing precisely what it was created to do. It's not working. The criminal justice system has achieved the ends that it has. I mean, this sounds like a conspiracy, but you know, that when the drug laws were changed and when so many of the things in that system were changed, resulting in this country having the largest incarcerated population in the world, that's not an accident. And so you do have to be reminded. I mean, I wish there was a narrative that we can make that would be successful at demonstrating more clearly. This may seem unfocused, but this is the way that I think. There was a book written by a Harvard Medical School doctor who had done a study of things that people are persuaded to support that are contrary to their interest. And what he did was he focused primarily on 3 things. I can only remember 2 now. One was guns, and one was medical care. And he describes in this book going to someone in Kentucky who could not get health care because Kentucky limited your access to it in a way as much as they possibly could. And the doctor went to him and said, if you lived a mile away in Ohio, they would pay for your health care. How do you feel about the fact that you cannot afford to go to a doctor? And his response was, well, I think the government should stay out of things. And he thought that even though it was literally killing him. And when this doctor went to speak to people whose children had chanced upon one of the many guns that they kept in their houses and killed themselves or killed other people in the house, they said, aren't you worried? Don't you see the impact that having guns readily available can have? And they go, but yes, we have this Second Amendment right, and we don't want to do anything to compromise that. And until we can find a message to like shake people and say, wake up, you know, it's going to be a challenge. But yes, that is certainly true. The hypocrisy is extraordinary.
Anyone else in the room? Yeah, Esther, you want to come up and get on camera range?
Thank you.
Great speech and important topic. I wanted to ask you about the whole controversies around critical race theory and around structural racism, because on one hand, seeing all these people in these school boards around the country talking about critical race theory, and really it's this new boogeyman, you know, that seems like a bad thing. But on the other hand, people are actually talking about structural racism in this country, and that could be a good thing. So, and we're at this sort of crossroads in this country where it could go either way. And what I hope happens is that people, like children, when they find that their books are being taken out of their schools, are going to start to maybe actually want to read those books. But could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure.
Because it's a big topic now.
It is a big topic, and it's one of particular interest to me. I was fortunate in law school to have had Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, as one of my professors before he left Harvard, because he opposed their hiring practices, and have also worked closely with Kim Crenshaw, who is also one of the founding members of critical race theory. The problem is, of course, that the objections to critical race theory are not based on what critical race theory is, and in fact, you've seen people, reporters, whether it's from an evening comedy show or some other station, go up and ask people who are saying we have to get critical race theory out of our school, and you ask them, what is it? And they're like, well, I don't know, but it's bad. But you're right that there are groups of people, a lot of the reports focus on the serious problems that are having in school boards and things like that, not only with critical race theory, but all of these things where, school board members are being threatened and things like that. But there are a number of elections where the people who opposed those kind of restrictions won. And I think that there has to be a way to change the narrative, but it's a challenge. And it's a challenge because it is a threat. And the threat is, I just think of a meme that I saw on Instagram recently, and it was the picture of Ruby Bridges being led into school surrounded by marshals, and the meme had said something like, if she had to endure this to go to school, your kid can handle learning about it. And yes, I'm not completely confident that we're at a stage where, forgive me, where white people are ready to do that, or where enough white people are willing to do that. But we got to get there. We cannot not get there.
Over to Zoomland.
Thank you very much. I love this topic that we spoke about today, but I have always maintained one thing. Every child has the opportunity to get an education. Nobody has ever turned a child away from a public school. Maybe private school you can't afford private school, but every single child is given the same opportunity to learn. And every public class has IEP programs where if the child is having trouble learning, they can get help from the schools. So why are we saying that our children are not getting the education that they need? Why are we saying that public education is not available when it is truly available? And the same thing for voting. Every person in this nation has the opportunity to vote. All they have to do is go and register. So why are we saying there's a problem? What is actually the problem?
Yeah, the problem is that's just not true. It's just not true. Not every child has a right or has the opportunity to get an equal education. My daughter is working in New Jersey now, and she's finishing up her program as a school psychologist, and she's working in a school in Jersey City, and she is appalled at the inability of her students to get an IEP and to get those services provided, even though they're entitled by IDEA and ADA. The law is there, but the reality isn't. The fact is that schools with large numbers of children of color are the ones with the largest classes, the fewest resources, the teachers who are least likely to be teaching in their expertise, the teachers who are least likely to be there for the whole semester. My own experience was coming from a public school in a suburb of New York City, a very poor suburb, where I was told by my teachers in the public school that because I was a black kid, I should be taking shop classes. And because of the fact that I ended up going to a private school where I was told you should expect to go to college, there was a difference. And so it's not true that everyone has the same opportunity. As for voting, you only need to look so far as the film from the elections where you see in black neighborhoods that people wait online for 4 or 5 hours to vote, whereas in suburban neighborhoods, you just stroll in and you vote. There are states where they are creating requirements that have the impact of disenfranchising people of color. This is not a new thing. It is something that has existed since the 19th century, whether it's ID requirements, whether it's closing polling places in neighborhoods of color. Those are the realities, and those are the realities that make it unequal. And we have to recognize that. You know, the fact is there are so many things that are linked to wealth. There are, if you compare the experience of a student in a public school in a rich suburb to the experience in a poor black or brown neighborhood, it's impossible to say that they have the same opportunity. So forgive me for perhaps being too strident, but just as a black person, when I hear everyone has an opportunity, we live in different worlds.
I see, I'll just comment on that too, that I see at least 4 people that in our Zoom chat have also said that they understand that there is not equal equality for these, equal opportunity for some students. I just want to put that out there. The next one from Zoom is Gwen Levine. If you'll please unmute yourself and proceed with your question.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your comments, but I'm concerned about something. You talked about what it is we need to do. This injustice is so built into our system. My question is, how do we do it? It was so intentional, the drug war, the zoning laws, everything was intended to make this injustice happen. It's a caste system. And what do? Even if we know what's wrong and we have the best of intentions, I feel very hopeless about it. It is such a deep-seated problem. What can we do? How can we do it?
And I know that it seems hypocritical for me to say this, but we can't lose hope. And I'll talk to you a little bit about where I find hope.
Okay.
I think that there are things you could do locally. I think that there are that all of the things you were taught about, voting and you know, putting pressure on local authorities, are things that could be done. Supporting groups that are working to make change are important. But I think maybe one of the most important things is we no longer have the luxury for even people who have advantages to be quiet. And that's the most important thing that I can think of. And that means one of the people who had a really profound effect on my life was a fellow student when I was in college and it was a school in Vermont, so it's not a place where there are a lot of people of color, and she was in a room where it was all white students and someone made a racist or an anti-Semitic comment, I forget which it was, and she exploded at them. Too often people would just be silent, and because of that, people feel that they have the permission to do and say those things. And I think we each have a responsibility to step up, whether it's sexual orientation or anything, that good people can't be silent. Because the people who are not good are not silent. And you had asked about whether we can use the critical race theory as a turning point, and it's possible, but it means a lot of work. I often think of the famous Mark Twain quote where he says that by the time truth has tied its shoelaces, lies are spread across the world. And we certainly see that now, that untruths move faster than truth. But that can't stop us. I talked about what I do to find hope, and a lot of people ask me that, and particularly my students, because they say, you seem so cynical, I don't know how you continue to do this. And I continue to do it for a number of reasons. One of them, the woman who used to head the NAACP Legal Defense Fund when I was there was an extraordinary woman, the first black student at the University of Virginia Law School. And Elaine Jones is her name. And she describes experiences like she would go to law school classes and people would walk up to her into the hallway and say, could you clean up the room down there? The garbage cans have to be emptied, because it was unthinkable to them that she would be a student. And what she would always say is that we have a responsibility to recognize that the struggles we're talking about are difficult troubles. They've taken centuries to create. They will take a long time, and we will never completely eliminate them. The message that I'm seeing this year is we can never relax. We can never think because we got this right that it's safe, because those rights are really fragile. But what Elaine used to say is that it is literally a relay race. And we got the baton from someone who carried it before. And I'm sure each of you can think in your lives of people who made it possible for you to be sitting there now. And then think, what could I do to make it possible for someone else to do that? Because when Thurgood Marshall started, or Charles Hamilton Houston started to think about how do we end separate but equal, this was in the United States in 1920 or 1930, when there was a hostile court, where there was racism everywhere. It would have been so easy for him to say, we can never change this. We can never break it down. And if he had, I wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't be at least a country where there's the hope that we can do better. I think we have the responsibility to do that. Again, think of the people who are really important to you, and think of how difficult it was for them, and think about how much difference they made. And then think about what is it that you can do to make that difference. Not everyone is going to be, Thurgood Marshall, but everyone can in their own lives try to make changes, try to make it possible to make changes. Because if we do that, we would be such a great country. We would be such a great country.
One thing that wasn't mentioned today in your talk, but it was an excellent talk. I spent a lot of my legal career protecting tenants from eviction here in New Jersey.
Yes.
And what we've not mentioned today is the horrible and tremendous housing problem we now have in this country because of the ending of the moratorium on evictions that are occurring slowly throughout the country. State by state, it's perceived that thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people will be losing their homes because of the ending of the eviction moratoriums. One of the problems in this country is that we do not deem housing to be a right. We deem it to be a privilege. But once you lose your housing, you lose everything. You lose every other opportunity to make a life for yourself. And I just want to cite one thing. We used to accept things like rent leveling and rent control here in the metropolitan area as an example, but over the last 10, 15 years, real estate interests have caused the erosion of rent controls, not only in New York City, but here in Bergen County, so that the tremendous escalation of rents that we're seeing all over the country now and causing evictions can occur because legislation has been eroded that protected tenants. So I think we need to make a lot of improvement in that area also. We're going to see homeless people all over the country on our streets.
No, you're absolutely right, and that was a serious omission on my part, because it is certainly something that does have an enormous impact. It is, again, the kind of thing that is an example, though, of how the majority of people can be basically hoodwinked into permitting something that benefits only a very small number of people. But you're absolutely right, and there should be outrage in the states that have received all this money that's supposed to be assistance, and that money hasn't gotten out. That's horrific. And, you know, I mentioned the welfare rights movement, which was ultimately a failed movement of the 1960s, because one of the things that it aimed for, the ultimate goal, was what it called a right to life, not the right to life that you hear now, but the idea that by virtue of being a human being, there are some things you should be able to count on. You should be able to count on housing. You should be able to count on health care. And we are so far behind so many places in the country, in the world, for all of these basic ideas. And, you know, that should change. But I appreciate your work, and it is absolutely essential.
Okay, question from our elf. It's hard to take me seriously when I'm dressed like this, I recognize. Thank you so much for the talk.
Sure.
So I work for a for-profit healthcare company, and so does Patty. And much of what they do in the Medicaid space is to think about how to solve the social determinants of healthcare. So housing, food, transportation, some very basic things that prevent somebody from getting the healthcare they need. Somebody doesn't get the healthcare they need, it manifests itself in every way we can think of, in the family structure, economically, in every way. So we think a lot about, in our jobs, we work for these big for-profit companies. Are we really doing enough, or are we just checking the box because we work for these for-profit companies? But then beyond that, and this is really more germane to my question, that's just one small segment of all of this sort of injustice and issues that we think about every day. Just yesterday, we had a conversation about human trafficking, and what can we do to address that concern? Is there anything that she and I can do in our daily lives? Should we contribute time, money? And what about this other thing, and this other thing? And there's so many of them that we wind up thinking that there's this some measure of chaos, and it gets daunting that there's so many areas that we want to invest our own energies in, compel people in our communities and our friends to join in us in these things and to address the grave misjustices, injustices in the world. So how would you recommend to this audience and broadly, how do we figure out where to invest our energies to impact change, to bring awareness, education, and to try to make a positive impact?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and one I don't have a complete answer to, but I think part of it is to start locally, to start, you know, with big problems, you have to break them down. But I think what you describe is exactly right, the recognition that a lot of our problems are big because we don't take care of them when they're little. And I don't want to say this in a way that sounds like I'm saying something negative about public defenders, because I think that they are exceptional people, and I think that there's almost something sacred about the work that we did. But one of the frustrations that I felt when I was in the criminal courts in Brooklyn was, we shouldn't be taking care of this in a courthouse. This should have been taken care of in a school building or in a doctor's office or in someplace else. and it wasn't. And as a result, we end up paying huge amounts of money. You know, if you look at the differences in health outcomes, one of the things, and it kind of goes to what I was saying about how hard it can be to find a legal solution, but someone once came to me and said, can you bring a race discrimination case because of the infant mortality rates of black women? And you know, it's a horrifying statistic. You know, black women, regardless of how much money they have a much higher infant mortality rate than white women. And we struggle to figure out how to do that, and it's hard to do, but it's an example of the way that differences in services, differences and dealing with the racial issue are really necessary. But again, you could do it in a local level. You could start to impress, you know, that study about preschool was so fascinating to me. It was in the Times last week, and they talked about just this whole cascade of events that occur from kids having educational opportunities in 3rd or 4th grade. And so it suggests that there's something you can do. You have access to a board of education, and who maybe would welcome not having to fight over critical race theory, and would instead love to find a way to make sure that there's universal preschool for students. So to make sure that there are opportunities for all students for after-school activities, for alternatives to violence and crime. And that's something you can do on a local level, and there are communities that have done it. You know, it impresses me how in emergencies people come together. You know, my church is part of a program that I think I may have read you are too, of, you know, providing services for Afghan people who are refugees who are being located in this country. We do better with emergencies than we do with the slow simmering problems. And I think we need to bring that same kind of energy to that. You know, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't. You know, I'm thrilled that we're helping Afghan refugees, but you know, we need to bring that intensity to all of the issues that we face.
Okay, back to Zoomland.
Yes, I mentioned earlier that we had a number of comments regarding the lack of equal opportunity for students, and I want to read a representative comment from one of the commenters. This is from Dan Farrat, who is himself a professional educator, and he writes, "My school is in a wealthy, predominantly white area and provides every student with a MacBook Air. Students in Hackensack High School don't have computer access at home and even all the time in school." And by the way, someone earlier had said remote learning is also very difficult for some of these students. Dan continues, "That is not equal access to education. At least in New Jersey, public schools are funded by local taxes. The lower the income of people in the area, the lower the tax base, thus the lower the school budget. So poor people don't get schools with the same funding as rich people. Equal opportunity is impossible in that system." And again, I thought that was representative of a number of comments. And then I want to go to Rachel Parada, who has her hand up. Rachel, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I am an administrator at Columbia in the School of Public Health, working with students in health policy and management. And I guess I've been feeling a lot of despair lately, and at the same time feeling a lot of hope, both working with these students and having an 18-year-old at home and seeing the energy and passion with which young people want to change the world. And yet my students come to me and say they want to be consultants. And how do I get these young, energetic people to like, how do we get young people involved in the things that will change the world? Mm-hmm. You know, they could be asking for government, they could be asking for nonprofit, they could be asking for policy, or even hospital management. And yet that's what they come in knowing about. It's just that one option. They're going to go into consulting, and that's it. They think they're going to change the world that way. Yeah, how do we get young people involved?
There are few issues or a few things that come up. You know, I mentioned my daughter, who is a psychology grad student at Teachers College at Columbia, and she will graduate with a debt burden that is almost incomprehensible. And fortunately, she will have an option of forgiveness in 10 years. But that is one of the things. I always survey my law students and ask them, how much debt do you have? And the numbers they come back with are breathtaking. $200,000-$300,000 in debt. And that drives many of them, and I understand it. And please, I always tell my students, I don't expect you to do the same jobs that I do. I will respect someone who decides they want to do tax because they love tax. Do what you love. I always tell them to do it, but whatever it is you do, do it ethically. And that, you know, one of the things that I learned when I look back at a number of my law school classmates who, you know, are living in huge, big, beautiful houses, but who are not necessarily satisfied by their work. And I could tell my students, you know, I mean, other than my worries about making enough money for my budget, there's never been a Monday where I've thought, oh God, I have to go to work. And they can't say that. And there's a value to that. So, you know, I think trying to make it possible for people to afford to do something else, you know, I mean, it's interesting. I've known people who have left positions like the ones that I have because they were told that, you know, they would be consultants and that they could make a big change, and then found out that that was not always the case. But I think making it possible for people to do what they truly want, and stressing that no matter what they do, that they should do it in a way that is ethical, I appreciate. You know, I imagine if someone came up to you and said, we have this healthcare policy which is going to hurt people, that you would not do that. And, you know, that's I mean, first of all, because Santa would be so pissed at you. But, but no matter what you do, you know, you do it in a way that's ethical. You do it in a way that has the values that this group, you know, when you read what ethical culture is about, yes, it's like the hokey pokey. That's what it's all about. You know.
Yeah, we have to live our values.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you so much for this talk.
Pleasure.
So much of what you said really resonated with me, and particularly what your response to Pam about education. I'm a school social worker, and you know, I certainly know firsthand the disparities, and you know, where I worked in a all-white community as opposed to inner city schools, and just as you addressed it. So thank you for that. And also what you had to say about just acting locally. I think that is so very important. We, you know, just to know that we can act locally. And one of the things, and I just taking advantage of having the podium here, one of the ways to do that as parents, I think, you know, I have 2 small granddaughters, and they live a very white privileged life, and I go out of my way to buy them books all the time about race, about Ruby Bridges. I want them to know that. So education can start at home first, educating our own kids and teaching them about race and racial injustices. And then, of course, you know, bringing it to our schools, very local level. So thank you. Thank you. I just would like to end with a quote, which I think is a very relevant quote. And so one of my heroes, John Lewis, And of course, most of us know this quote, but I think it's very relevant to our talk. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Do not become bitter or hostile. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. We will find a way to make a way out of no way. And I think that's just very relevant to your talk. So.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ethicalfocus.org, and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.